It seems that over the last 10 years, there have been various attempts to rank the world or segment the world in terms of growth. And now the Velocity 12 report provides a fresh new way to do that. Can you talk a little bit about what the intention of that is and why that's necessary now?
Well, first of all, the intention of segmenting the world is, I think, a very good one, a very useful one. So we all found BRICS, that acronym, which is Brazil, Russia, India, China, and a little bit of South Africa added on, enormously useful. We ourselves guided our global strategy in terms of BRICS. We measured our growth in terms of BRICS. But there's one problem with BRICS. Firstly, that some of the BRICS started to fall off a bit, and the first one to fall was Russia. That just didn't have the strength, the size, the scale, and the growth that a China had, for instance, or in India. And then more recently, Brazil has also fallen off. So it started to make us think, well, was that really still the best way of looking at the world? And of course, underneath BRICS, there is another issue, which is that BRICS was devised by Goldman Sachs, by bankers, in a sense. Nothing wrong with that at the time, but it's not perhaps the only way of looking at the world. So the successor measures or indices to BRICS, none of them have been comprehensive. So there was Civets, I don't know if you remember that one. Then
Yes.
There was N11, I don't know if you remember that one. The problem with those is they don't contain India and China. So we started to look to see whether there was another way of looking at the world. And we decided, since we were in the business of talking to consumers, in the business of helping clients make money and profit from consumers by building franchises, that we should look at consumers. So we worked with some demographers, in fact a very original demographer, to look at a different way of compiling a ranking, which was to look at the speed at which the middle classes in the developing countries was growing.
And Miles, that resulted in 12 countries, the Velocity 12, 8 of which are in Asia, 2 of which are in Africa, 2 of which are in Latin America. What surprised you about the 12, and what does it imply when you look at that list of 12 and the relative size of the 12?
Well, there are some that are very obvious, and you'd expect them to be there. So China is absolutely up there with a very significant middle class growth in the next 10 years. That's the period that we're talking about. But the one that surprised me, and I think everyone, just because of the sheer scale of the middle class growth, was India. This is bringing in 400 million new consumers into the middle class in the next 10 years. That's an enormous number, and that's much more than twice what China's bringing in. So India is the top of the ranking, in fact. Beyond that, the other surprise is that countries in South Asia, apart from India, are also very, very evident in the table. So you've got Pakistan, which is bringing in a substantial number, as much as the whole population of Italy in the next 10 years. You've got Indonesia after that. You've got Bangladesh, which is not really recognized as a market of importance at this stage by most multinationals. And then you've got other important parts of the world. You've got Equatorial Africa, with Nigeria coming in strongly, not to forget Latina, Mexico, which was never on the BRIC list, or should have been in my view. You've got some other markets coming in. Plus, there's a couple of markets that are quite new. So Myanmar, which has just newly entered into the global trading system, is in there towards the bottom of the list. And there's probably one other market that should be there, just scraping against the bottom and not yet fully part of our world, which is Iran, but it's going to come.
Would it be fair to say that when you look at the implications of that, there's effectively a kind of rebasing or refocus in South Asia from China? Or how do you see that issue going forward?
I don't think it's a rebasing from China, because we're talking about parallel growth. What we're talking about, I think, is the need for the world to have a different perception of where the growth is coming from in the future. And that is much, much more South Asian focused, along with China. So this is a different way of looking at the world. I think most clients, most journalists, most commentators don't have it yet in their mind that the future of the world is India, surpassing China in 10 years in terms of quantum. And then after that, it's the countries around India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Myanmar, Indonesia, a little bit further away, which are going to provide the growth. And so the world hasn't got into understanding what the caricature, if you like, of growth is like. And let me tell you, it's South Asian, it's female, because we're seeing the empowerment of women in a lot of these countries. It's Muslim, because many of these countries are either Muslim, have very large Muslim minorities, and it's urban. And that is the new identikit picture of the future of the world. People don't have that in their minds when they think about the future.
Well, there's another thing that people seem to have in their minds about the future is growing inequality. And there's an area of the study that challenges at least a portion of that global view that's been popular the last couple of years, that global wealth has created very unequal worlds. What's your viewpoint on that?
Let me just talk for a second about the methodology of the report, because what it does is to look at the country's share of middle class growth, and then it looks at the speed of that middle class growth, what we call the velocity. We measure that in terms of incomes, and incomes adjusted on a PPP method, so you even out any differences. So we're looking at wealth in an interesting way, which is by share of income. Conventional views of wealth, the views that are continually hitting the headlines, look at it in terms of absolute wealth, how rich you are. And of course, on that basis, there's the most glaring and terrible inequality in the world. We know that 1% of the world has a totally disproportionate amount of wealth, and that there is great poverty at the bottom of the pyramid. But there's another story also, which is the growing equality of the world, and that's coming in the big middle, if you like, and that's coming in terms of income growth. So more people moving into a middle income bracket out of the lower income brackets. That is what we mean by middle class. And over the last 20 years, of course, many people have emerged in developing markets out of poverty into the middle class. What we're saying is the velocity of that is going to increase. And by the year 2025, 2035, you're going to see countries which have historically been thought of as exceptionally poor actually resembling normal middle class countries. That is a big change. There's another big change, which is at some stage in around 2030, China and India will become normative. In other words, they'll be as wealthy as the other countries in the world. That's the first time in history, or maybe in history for 2,000 or 3,000 years, that that's happened. That is a very startling statistic.
Multinational companies have looked for growth for decades now and have invested for growth. What does this all mean both for multinational companies and perhaps for local companies that are also growing rapidly as these markets grow and mature and provide opportunities?
For multinational companies, I think it means they've got to take a very close look at where their priorities are. So in my experience, many multinational countries don't take markets like Pakistan seriously at all. For instance, I actually in another role, I've been chairman of the US-Pakistan Business Council. I have to lead trade missions to Pakistan. I see how difficult it is for American companies to get behind the headlines and to understand that there is a vibrant business in Pakistan. Once they're there, they realize it. So for both Coca-Cola and Pepsi-Cola and the soft drink markets, for P&G, Pakistan is a significant market, but other countries aren't in there yet. There's a kind of corporate timidity. So we have to apply focus and sometimes refocus. That's the first lesson for them. The second lesson for them is that it's a much tougher game than ever before, because they're competing not just with themselves, but they're competing with a vibrant cadre of local competitors that have grown up to service this new middle class. Now, those local competitors have got some advantages. First of all, they're more nimble. Secondly, they're closer to their customers. Thirdly, they can get insights more easily. And fourthly, they are often more digitally attuned because they are in control of their own media mixes and they think digitally first, whereas a multinational will tend to have a global strategy and digital comes in as something further along the road. So it's a complicated, competitive world, and they are beginning to have to understand that they have to compete at that local level as much as at the global level. And that's a bit of a shock to a system which has been built up over the last 20 or 30 years on the back of marketing gurus who've all talked about globalism. We are still global, but we need to acknowledge the competitive battleground needs to be fought much more with local weapons.
Right. So, as a final question, given what you said earlier about the velocity drivers you noted, women, progressive Muslim consumers, urbanization, technology, and what you've just said regarding local and international brands, if you're advising people in terms of how to perhaps step change in the future, what one or two things would you advise them to think about most in terms of what they need to do in this new velocity world?
One thing would be to take Muslims seriously. You know, we've tried to do it. We have an Islamic marketing consultancy, Ogilvy Noor, in our agency, and it's run by some very intelligent and sensitive people. I would say that its traction has been so-so. Why? Because the headquarters of global corporations don't have baked into their DNA yet the fact that a very, very large percentage of their future growth is going to come from Islamic consumers. Now, we know from research that Islamic consumers have got many segments, but a segment which is very attractive and a segment which is fueling a lot of the growth is what we call Islamic modernists. Now, they are consumers who need modern halal branding. They need some reassurance that the brand acknowledges their belief system. In the report, we found that 60% of those Muslim futurists felt the multinational brands did not understand them. Now, that is a horrifying statistic.
Yes.
On the other side of the coin, we've got developing in some markets really interesting Islamic brands. In Indonesia, we have a brand called Wada, for instance. It's a personal care brand. It's designed to create beauty in an Islamic context. It's highly digital. Its whole marketing is based on a concept of ambassadors and a concept of a website that receives social and reinforcing posts that builds a community. These are the sorts of the brands of the future which multinational corporations, and indeed ourselves, have to recognize and acknowledge as being increasingly important.
Good. Thank you, Miles. Thank you for sharing your thoughts with us today.
It's a pleasure.